Some brothers in bondage are being transported when their overseers hear some noise ahead. The overseer calls out to the oncoming traveler. A German cat, Dr. King Schultz, emerges from the darkness. The doc immediately attempts to put the overseers at ease. He's not there to address these men's slave trading activity. He's there to find out if any of the men in transport previously slaved at a certain plantation. One man speaks up, and the doc approaches. The man Django tells the doc that the wanted men oversaw at the plantation where he previously resided. While the doc is questioning Django, they're interrupted by the overseers. The overseers are frustrated over losing control of the situation, and one of them puts the doc at gunpoint. Now here's the thing about Doc. He will not hesitate one fraction of a second to shoot you square in the ass. Doc fires shots at the overseers. One is shot dead, while the other one's horse took the bullet. The doc tells the man to stop all that yelling and moaning so he can resume his conversation with Django. Django can ID the wanted men that the doc is looking for. Doc purchases Django from the reluctant seller with a dead horse laying on his body. Doc orders Django to mount the horse of the dead man. As Django sheds his cloak, the doc is visibly shaken by the sight of Django's whip-shredded back. As to the other brothers, the doc volunteers some wise advice. They can either take the injured overseer all the way back to the plantation that they came from, or they can put a hot one in his wicked head and make a run for it up north. I guess the brothers flipped a coin on it. Heads, we shoot you in the head. Tails, we shoot you in the head twice. Tails it is. Django and the doc's journey leads them into a small town. The sight of a black man on a horse has the place abuzz. White folks' mouths are locked open, and the local whores got their faces pressed against the glass. The doc is not on familiar grounds. He's puzzled as to why these town folk are stunned. Then the doc walks Django through the front door of a saloon to grab a drink. The saloon owner freaks out and hightails it to get the sheriff. In his absence, the doc pours a couple of beers and joins Django. Doc is a bounty hunter. He acquires the target, he finds the target, he kills the target, he delivers the target, he gets paid. Doc is strictly business. Well, to a certain extent. The doc has a moral compass. He's no fan of slavery. But given Django's situation, Django's not in a position to say no. With an understanding of the assignment, Django will indeed ID the wanted men. And in exchange, the doc will grant him his freedom. The two men hear a commotion outside. The sheriff is on his way. The men are ordered out onto the town center by the sheriff. The sheriff is talking tough, but remember what I said about old Doc. He will push a bullet into your skull in a heartbeat. The doc 86'd the sheriff. And then the doc went gangster and turned around and went right back into the saloon to finish his beer. Django done got himself caught up in some white-on-white crime madness. Now here comes the marshal marching down the street, and he means business. He locks down the exits of the saloon and orders the guys out. The negotiations for surrender begin. The doc agrees to walk out of the saloon on the guarantee that he won't be shot down upon exit. The marshal agrees. The doc tells Django to let him handle the situation. Just keep quiet. Aight, player. I wasn't gonna say shit anyway. Once outside, the doc informs the marshal that the sheriff laying over there collecting flies is a wanted outlaw with a live bounty on his head. So technically, the doc was doing the work that the marshal should have been doing himself. One outlaw dead, bounty settled. Pay up, marshal. We take checks, but we prefer cash, homie. The pair leave town and make a rest stop. The doc digs into Django's background. Django is a married man. His wife's name is Broomhilda. The doc is fascinated. Not only does Django's wife have the name of German origin, she also speaks the tongue. Django and his wife recently got separated after a failed runaway. After capture, they both were branded with matching letter R's on their cheeks, the letter R marking them as runaways. Then they were separated and sold off to different plantations. The sun rises and the men ride off. Doc explains the strategy. They're going to hit up every plantation until they find the wanted men. Django chose to sport an outfit from the 1770 Little Boy Blue collection. They arrive at the plantation of Big Daddy. Now, I'm not going to call another grown man Big Daddy, so I'll just call him Mr. Bennett. And Bennett, he ain't down with a black man on a horse on his plantation. When Doc tries to go into detail about Django's status as a free man, things get contentious. But tempers are cooled a bit when Doc tells Bennett that he's there to do business. Bennett is still sort of defiant. He wants these interlopers to leave his property. Things change when Doc tells Bennett that he's got some deep pockets and that he's ready to purchase some of Bennett's enslaved workers. Money talks and white power walks, at least until the deal is secured. Then they go right back to being racist. Doc asks Bennett to have one of his field hands give Django a tour of the plantation while the two conduct business. This will give Django an opportunity to search for the Brittle brothers. Bennett volunteers Bettina to be Django's guide. Being that Django is a free man, Bettina is a little confused about what level of hospitality to extend to him. She's told to show respect, but not too much. Bettina begins to show Django the layout of the property. Django cuts her babbling short and begins to solicit the information that he came to get. When Django directly inquires about the Brittle brothers, Bettina doesn't know them, but there are men on the plantation that fit the description. Django spots a man in the field and recognizes him as one of the Brittle brothers. Django then has a flashback to the day when Broomhilda and himself tried to escape. They made their way through the woods, but eventually they were apprehended. Django pleaded with the overseer to shoulder the punishment for the couple, but the overseer knew that Django having to watch Broomhilda take the weight would hurt him even more. And it was the Brittle brother over in the field that cracked the whip on his wife. With one of the brothers ID'd, Bettina tells Django that the other two brothers are over at the stables. After instructing Bettina to go fetch the doc, Django power marches his way towards the stables. Motherfucker gonna learn today. Django walks up on one of the Brittle brothers preparing to whip his sister for breaking some damn eggs. I know. The price of eggs is through the roof right now, but don't nobody need to suffer cause of it. Django announces himself, and with a quickness, he shoots the Brittle brother in his cold heart. Old boy dropped like shit from a mule. Then another one of the Brittle brothers ran from behind the stables. This cat was fumbling trying to get his gun out of the holster. Django grabbed the dead brother's whip and went to town on old boy. Now the rabbit got the gun. The black folk on the plantation watched in amazement, as if the white man's God that they'd been praying to all this time had finally come to answer their black prayers. Django's shoulder must have gave out, cause eventually he put old Butterfingers out of his misery. Doc arrives on the scene and asks Django what the hell is going on. Django tells him in baseball terms, it's the bottom of the ninth, game tied. I got 2 men out and there's a man on third. Doc took his rifle and he came in tight and inside with that heat. He picked off the runner trying to make it home. The last remaining Brittle brother, he dead. Mr. Bennett rolls up on the scene with backup. He's ready to put Doc and Django down without question. Doc slows his roll. Doc comes clean about being a bounty hunter and tells him that there was a price on the 3 men's heads. Bennett takes the warrant and Speed reads it. I seriously doubt Bennett could read. After everything is said and done, Bennett is pissed, but he's gotta let the 2 men walk. But that doesn't mean that he's gonna let them get away. That night, Bennett tracked Django and Doc to their resting spot. Bennett rounded up his boys for a sneak attack on the 2. But before these barbarians can proceed, they gotta deal with a wardrobe malfunction. Their hood holes ain't lining up. Apparently, cutting 2 holes in a sack is a level of complexity that this group of geniuses couldn't master. The men began to turn on one another. They want to do a one-off without the hoods. Bennett makes an executive order that the hoods stay on and that they get on with the ambush. They make their way down and encircle the wagon, looking for their victims. They come up empty. Doc and Django are laying await in the hills. Doc takes a shot, hitting the wagon filled with dynamite, exploding it. The survivors begin to scatter. Doc picks off a few, and then he hands the rifle to Django, giving him the privilege of killing the fleeing Mr. Bennett. Django waits, and then he finally tags Bennett. Big Daddy, Big Dead. That night, Doc and Django continue to get acquainted. Doc tells Django about a famous German legend in which the damsel named Broomhilda is rescued by her brave suitor. With the bounty on the Brittle brothers secured, Doc makes Django an offer to continue collecting bounties throughout the winter. And once winter passes, Doc promises to assist Django in finding Broomhilda. Riding around Mississippi plantations ain't no joke, player. You're gonna need some backup. Django takes Doc up on his proposition. The men set out for a winter of bounty hunting. Django ain't a natural-born killer, though. On his first target, Django is reluctant to shoot an outlaw because the outlaw's little son is at his side. Doc has to emphasize to Django that these are evil men that they're hunting. Convinced that justice ain't gonna serve itself, Django makes his first bounty kill. Doc tells him to keep the handbill for good luck. Winter rolls on and Django becomes the true gunman, quick and accurate. The duo rack up on bodies and bounties. Winter is over and the time to find Django's wife has come. The men ride into Mississippi to visit the recorder's office. There, they find the records of Broomhilda's bill of sale. She's been sold to Calvin Candy, the owner of the notorious Candyland plantation. So, how are they going to rescue Broomhilda off the plantation? Django inquires whether they can simply make an offer. Doc counters with a plan that may be more reliable. A plan that, in the event that Calvin isn't interested in selling, would still manage them some room to negotiate. Doc plans to gain Calvin's attention through his interest in the Mandingo fight game. Doc is going to play a wealthy man looking to get into the sport, and Django is going to play his expert assistant in spotting talent. But Django is very reluctant to portray a slaver. Doc urges him to use his hatred for slavers to make his role play even more convincing. They arrive at an estate. Inside, they are welcomed by Calvin's assistant, Leo. Before the introductions are made, Leo tells Doc that despite Calvin's adaptation of French culture, don't engage him about his interest. Cat don't know nothing about France. He out here frontin'. The men walk in on a Mandingo fight in progress. Calvin Candy diverts his attention long enough to make notice of his company. He casts a suspicious glance towards Django. Calvin invites Doc to join him, up close and personal to watch the action. As Calvin barks his instructions to his fighter, Doc is taken aback at the inhumanity of the spectacle. Calvin's fighter comes out on top. Calvin, being the savage that he is, orders his fighter to finish off his opponent with a hammer. Calvin turns his attention towards Django. When Calvin questions where Django's Mandingo knowledge comes from, Django fires back as to why Calvin questions his knowledge. Noticing that the hostilities are quickly escalating, Doc intervenes and directs the attention back to himself. Calvin and Django engage in another clash of opinion. Django voices his dissatisfaction with Calvin's stock of fighters. Calvin is more than prepared to walk away from this proposition. The prospect of parting with any of his fighters wasn't his idea to begin with. When Doc finally puts a hard price tag on his ambitions, Calvin lights up. Those were the winning numbers, sir. Doc and Django get their foot in the door. The following morning, the parties are en route to Candyland. When one of Calvin's helpers mouths off to Django, Django throws him off of his horse. Before worker Billy can pull his piece, Django gets the draw on him. Calvin raises up and puts out the fire, to Billy's disappointment. Amongst the caravan is a group of Calvin's fighters. One of the fighters can't keep his eye off of the apparently traitorous Django. Django proceeded to berate and dress down the mean-mugging brother, to the amusement of Calvin and his people. Doc requests a pit stop, presumably to calm down the charged-up Django. Doc tells Django that he has confirmation that Broomhilda is at Candyland. Not necessarily by name, but it ain't a lot of enslaved German-speaking sisters in the South. It's gotta be her. Doc tells Django that he might want to turn down the volume on the evil slaver act. The act is verging upon the edge of provocation. It might piss off Calvin. Django reminds Doc that he requested a piece of shit slaver, so that's exactly what he's giving him. Along the way, the caravan approaches one of Calvin's posts. There's an issue in progress. One of Calvin's fighters, D'Artagnan, made a run for freedom and has now found himself trapped atop a tree. Calvin coaxes the man out of the tree. D'Artagnan wants out of the fight game. It ain't in him no more. Well, an evil bastard like Calvin ain't got no mercy. With the hunting dogs ready to attack, Calvin contemplates the proper punishment for D'Artagnan. The Doc sees where this shit is headed. He speaks up and offers to cover Calvin's perceived losses. This raises Calvin's suspicion as he sees little value in the fighter. So why is Doc trying to save him? Django speaks out that Doc isn't going to put money into a bad investment. This seals the brother's fate. Calvin locks eyes with Django and looks for Django's endorsement of what's to come. Django holds steady and plays his role. The dogs are let loose and they proceed to rip D'Artagnan from limb to limb. Django remains stoic, and Calvin, the savagery is second nature to him. He keeps his eyes locked on Django. But Doc is horrified. Django explains that unlike his boss, the brutal nature of America, i.e. the white man, no longer shakes him up. The parties approach Candyland. Waiting for them is the head house Negro, Stephen. Barely reciprocating greetings, Stephen questions Django being allowed to sit atop a horse. Calvin explains to him that Django is a free man, but this means little to Stephen. The only thing stronger than Stephen's love of whiteness is his hatred of blackness. When Stephen finds out that Django is staying in the big house, he loses his composure to a point where Calvin has to yank him back down to obedience. Before Calvin can retire into the night with his sister Miss Laura, Doc raises his interest in the German-speaking woman Broomhilda. Turns out she's currently being punished, locked in an underground hotbox. Despite Stephen's objections to keep her in there for another week, Calvin orders that Broomhilda be released and prepared for the Doc's pleasure. Django watches as the hands make their way out to the box. They open it and pull out the drained body of Broomhilda. That night, Broomhilda is cleaned up and presented to the Doc. He invites her in and slams the door in Miss Laura's face. Inside, Broomhilda is puzzled. Doc is putting on clothes instead of taking them off. Doc informs Broomhilda that they have a mutual friend who's eager to see her. She expects the worst to come. The door opens and her husband Django steps out. Dinner is served. The buyers and the sellers are discussing fighters. Calvin has 3 premium fighters that he's touting as top-notch. Django disagrees that all 3 are championship material. The mere act of disagreeing with Calvin sets Steven off. The doc goes on about desiring a fighter that can move the crowd, a showman. Calvin educates him that the number one goal of a fighter is that that fighter can whoop some ass. The conversation then turns to Doc and his night with Broomhilda. Miss Laura makes an off-the-cuff comment that Broomhilda seems to rather fancy Django. Broomhilda slips up and fails to maintain her poker face. Steven takes notice. In the kitchen, Steven presses Broomhilda on whether she and Django have history together. She denies it. In the dining room, the negotiation for the fighters is heating up. Calvin begins to grow impatient with the haggling. He reminds them that they were the ones who approached them with the offer. Perhaps sensing that the plan is falling apart, Doc agrees to pay $12,000 for one of the fighters, Eskimo Joe. Doc requests to have his bankers and physicians stamp their professional approval before the deal is actually final. But for all intents and purposes, a deal has been struck. As Broomhilda enters the room, Steven suggests that they show the company her scarred back. Steven disrobes Broomhilda as Django tries to hold it together. Broomhilda's beaten and scarred back is exposed to the guest. Steven makes notice of Django's reaction. Once back in the kitchen, Steven turns up the interrogation on Broomhilda. She continues to deny knowing Django, but Steven is on to her. Back in the dining room, the doc has pivoted the conversation towards purchasing Broomhilda in addition to Eskimo Joe. Calvin is agreeable to selling Broomhilda. Steven re-enters the room and interrupts the negotiations. He requests a meeting with Calvin in private. Calvin is frustrated by the interruption, but given Steven's continued insistence, Calvin begins to ponder whether something might be afoot. Calvin excuses himself from the room. Steven tells Calvin that Doc and Django's interests are not as they seem. They don't want fighters, they want Broomhilda. Calvin is confused, since they just bought fighter Eskimo Joe for $12,000. Steven reminds him that the deal isn't final yet. Calvin is perplexed as to why they would go through that whole Mandingo fighting scheme just to get it buying Broomhilda. Steven tells him that they were just greasing him up so that the purchase of Broomhilda would go over without a fuss. Doc would later find reason to cancel the Eskimo Joe deal, but Broomhilda would be long gone. With this new information, Calvin re-enters the room and dismisses his sister Laura. He pulls out a skull and begins to go into story mode. The skull belonged to an enslaved man who was born and died on the plantation serving Calvin's family. Calvin grew up wondering why, given unlimited opportunities, the man never tried to kill his father. Calvin proposes a reasoning that explains the difference between him and that servant. Calvin goes into a half-baked theory that the black man is biologically subservient. He cuts open the skull and points out the inner dimples to support his argument. Calvin's demeanor slowly grows more and more sinister. He infers that if, and potentially when, he cracks open Django's head, the same dimples would be found. Suddenly, the doors swing open and Calvin's goon, Mr. Butch, gets the jump on Doc and Django. Calvin goes into a rage. He threatens the shotgun blast if either man makes a move. Calvin calms himself a bit. He then redresses the negotiation for Broomhilda. He orders Broomhilda out from the kitchen. Calvin brings up Doc's offer to pay a ridiculous price for the right fighter. Well, Calvin's going to transfer Doc's offer for Eskimo Joe over to the purchase of Broomhilda. It's not really much of a negotiation anymore, though. It's a demand. Calvin is holding all the cards. Broomhilda will sell for $12,000, or else Calvin's going to bash her head open right in front of them. Doc decides to part with his money and spare Broomhilda's life. Calvin declares his victory. While Broomhilda's bill will sell and freedom papers are being prepared, Doc awaits in the parlor. He's reliving the mental anguish of the brutality that he's witnessed during the past few days. From the Mandingo fighting, to the dogs ripping apart D'Artagnan, to Calvin threatening to bash open Broomhilda's skull. Here comes White Calvin with his white cake. Man, don't nobody want no damn cake at a time like this. A smug Calvin chastises Doc for moping around because his plan to get Broomhilda on the cheap fell apart. Doc corrects him. He tells him that his mood is due to the wickedness that he's been witness to. Doc brings up the French author who wrote the novel The Three Musketeers, Alexandre Dumas. He wonders what Dumas would think of these atrocities. Calvin is unaware of the author, despite his admiration and supposed knowledge of French culture. Doc then reveals to Calvin that the author, Alexandre Dumas, would have been in strict opposition to Calvin's actions. He informs Calvin that Alexandre Dumas was a black man. Calvin, considering himself being a man of higher intellect, is embarrassed for being exposed as a fraud. Before Calvin can pick up the pieces of his fractured ego, the doc grabs Broomhilda's papers, signs his name, and procures Calvin's signature. Legally, Broomhilda is now a free woman. Doc is ready to get out of there, but not before letting Calvin know that his company has been quite unpleasant. Calvin isn't gonna let Doc get off that easy. He tells Doc that in the South, a deal has to be sealed with a handshake. Doc ain't trying to hear it. He ready to go. Calvin insists, even to the point of threatening to shoot Broomhilda dead if the doc continues to resist. So the doc gives in. The man want to shake hands, I'll shake his hand. Remember what I said about Doc earlier. He will shoot a motherfucker. Killer's kill. Doc popped old racist ass Calvin in the chest. Old boy fell back against the bookcase holding his chest like Fred G. Sanford. And the G is for gone to meet his maker. Calvin, he dead. I'll give you a moment to celebrate. Well, after that, Mr. Butch spun around and pushed a hot one in the doc. The doc, he dead. Django got to work. He pulled Butch's piece from his waist and then gave him a headshot. What ensued next is an epic gun battle. The posse popped through the doors of the plantation. The posse got mowed down. There's a shooter up top. Got him. Django ran out of ammo, and them cats just kept on firing like they were in a video game. Django managed to grab a pistol from a fallen redneck. He then started to send some action back their way. But there's more rednecks and more rednecks. It was Redneck Boogaloo Part 2 in that junk. Django's still dropping bodies, but eventually it's too much firepower, and Django gets pinned down. Stephen yells out for the men to hold fire. Stephen informs Django that Broomhilda done went and got herself caught. Billy's got a gun to her head. Stephen tells Django to come out with his hands up. Django weighs the repercussions of a surrender, but unless he wants to lose Broomhilda after all of this, his only move is to surrender. The gun battle is over. What's left is a floor covered with rednecks, bullets, blood, and racism. Probably some doo-doo too. We see Django's fate, hanging upside down, butt-ass naked. Billy is in the room, ready to go medieval, on his nuts. Ball destruction is in Django's near future. Before Billy can assault them nuts, he's interrupted by Stephen, who tells him that Miss Laura has changed her mind. A disappointed Billy switches out of the stable. Stephen tells Django that the white folk are foaming at the mouth with vengeance. All of the usual methods of torture were thrown about, but Stephen suggested that that was way too easy of a way out for Django. Laura landed on the idea of sending Django to the mines. A lifetime of hard labor till the body can no longer endure, and then sudden death, and that'll be it for Django. So Django is being transported to the mines, trailing behind a prisoner cage. Django keeps calling out to the guards about an opportunity to make some money. To shut him up, one guard entertains Django's offer. Django tells him about a big money bounty on a gang of outlaws back at the Candyland plantation. Django provides the men with a handbill of the bounty as proof that he ain't lying. Mind you, this is the handbill from Django's first bounty kill, which has already been settled. He tells them that he can ID the outlaws and then they can take them down and collect the bounty money. Django continues to tell his story of how he ended up in this transport and that he's actually a bounty hunter himself. The guards are skeptical about Django's story, so they ask the enslaved fighters about Django. They verify that Django came into town riding on a horse with a white man, the white man that killed Calvin Candy. The guards are convinced that what Django said is true. They go back to Django, untie him, and return his weapons. Now, being involved in the slave trade is enough reason for these bastards to get shot, but these idiots deserved it even more for handing Django his guns back. Idiots. 3 of them. They dead. Django emerges from the smoke. He rides over to the brothers and unlocks the cage. Even the mean-mugging brother managed to squeeze out half a smile. Now it's time for some get back. Django rides back to Candyland. Some of the good old boys are hanging out in a shack. Django kicked in the door and started to explode suckers. One to the chest, one to the stomach, one to the ding-ding. Django rides over to the stables. He sees Doc's body lying in the corner. He walks over and retrieves Broomhilda's freedom papers from Doc's coat pocket. He then takes a moment of reverence for his old riding buddy. We see Broomhilda, once again, trapped in captivity. She hears footsteps approaching the room and braces herself for the worst. But it's Django, there to rescue her. The Candyland residents return home from stuffing Calvin into a hole. They gather inside and plan to resume their normal routine. Django appears at the top of the stairs. Vengeance mode activated. Old ball-cutting Billy gets the first shot. He's squealing like a pig. Django turned his volume down. Billy, dead. Django then notifies the brothers and sisters that the time for segregation has come. Don't catch no bullets with white folks' names on it. Can you believe old Steven thought he was gonna sneak out with the sisters? Nah, player. You gonna hang back. Time for Django to wrap it up. Miss Laura, you up next. Wave bye-bye to the peeps. The sisters don't waste no time getting up out of there. Steven, it's time for you to settle up. Old Steven acting like he still got some kick-ass in his bones. Django took out his knee. Despite Steven's grim circumstances, he's still talking tall shit. Django took out his other knee. The joke's on Django. His cat probably had 2 bad knees anyway. Django makes his way over to the exit to light the dynamite. And Steven still ain't slacking on the jaw-jacking. This cat's gonna go out like he came in, talking shit. Django strolls outside of Candyland where Broomhilda awaits him. Steven, the gig is up. But if you believe in all this afterlife stuff, I'm pretty sure you'll be reunited with Master Calvin in hell. See? It all works out. Tick, tick, tick. Oh, dynamite doesn't tick. Kaboom. Django turns and admires his handiwork. Job well done. Let's ride.